Hey guys, welcome to Digit.in, and today we are going to talk about the 16-inch MacBook Pro. Now typically MacBook Pros have been called many things: not worth it, underpowered, extremely sleek. There's a lot to talk about this machine. There's a lot of observations that we have, so we're going to get into that right away. But before we do make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates from us. Now we have with us a variant that comes spec'd with the Core i9 processor. So this is Intel's 9th generation Core i9 9880H. So the primary difference between the 9880H and the more powerful 9980 is just about 100 MHz. So this has a base clock of 2.3 GHz and boost of up to 4.8 GHz. Now this is a very important number. Make sure to keep a track of it. We're going to be bringing this up a lot when we talk about the performance. Besides the processor, there's also 16 GB of DDR4 memory. There's 4 GB of dedicated video RAM thanks to the Radeon Pro 5500M. There's 1 TB of ultra fast storage built in as well. In terms of the display, this is an all new 16-inch display with a 16:10 aspect ratio and a resolution of 3072 by 1920. The display covers both the sRGB and the DCI-P3 color space, and again we're going to be talking about that as well. So in terms of the specs, this is pretty much kitted out to the max as much as possible. Now you may think that 16 gigs of RAM may not be enough, and you may be correct. You want more RAM. All you have to do is just walk into an Apple store or Apple authorized reseller in India and request them to get you a model that has higher memory. They can do that. It is an option, although it just takes a few weeks for the delivery to take place. Now, having covered the specs, let's just dive right into it. We're going to talk about the performance. Now, to test the performance of the MacBook Pro, there is not a lot you can do in terms of benchmark numbers. Yes, you've got certain benchmark utilities like Geekbench, you've got certain tests to test the disk speed, but they really are not indicative of the true performance of Mac. Macs perform based on the fact that the OS, the hardware, and even the applications that are coded for this tend to work very seamlessly, and this we discovered while doing render tests between Final Cut Pro X and Premiere Pro. So what we did was we created a 5-minute edit in 4K on both Premiere and FCP. We made sure to use the same clips, same effects, same transitions, basically making the two clips look identical. The two timelines looked identical. We made sure there was no transcoding enabled and that everything was, the timeline itself was in 4K native resolution so that there was no down resolution happening. And while editing that footage in both FCP and Premiere, the scrubbing, right, when you're basically trying to preview the footage in the timeline, play back what you've edited, all of that was very smooth. Now this is surprising because this is 4K video that we're working with, not 1080p. All the files were stored locally on the Mac's internal drive. We also did the same thing with an external SSD. So again, no problems there. Where we really hit something interesting was while exporting this project. Now, there's a lot of debate between which is more superior, FCP or Premiere. Now, we have somewhat of an answer that should tip the scales in favor of one, especially if you're using a MacBook Pro. FCPX was able to export our 4K project much faster than Premiere Pro. Now we did the export in two formats, H.264, H.265. For H.264, when exporting to 4K, FCP took 346 seconds. Now that's a little over 5 minutes, whereas Premiere Pro took 840 seconds. That's way over about 14 minutes, roughly 14 minutes. This is very surprising, and we tried this with software encoder, hardware encoder, metal encoder, then also switched to Adobe Media Encoder as the export program. Still the numbers did not change. The time taken for the Premiere project to finally be rendered as an H.264 file did not change. Then 1080p took 206 seconds on FCPX, whereas it took 498 seconds on Premiere Pro. So notably, Premiere Pro was way slower when exporting 264 footage. And the interesting thing is we observed that we had Intel's Power Gadget open throughout our export process and realized that FCPX is hitting the CPU with a more sustained load, not overloading it, not letting it go to the max. And by keeping a load level between 70 to 80%, they're able to make sure that the boost clock stays as high as possible. We noted that during the export from FCPX, the i9 chip in here maintained its boost clock for a little over 2.5 minutes, throttled down for a few seconds, and then went right back up. So it generally stayed above the 4.2 gigahertz mark. Whereas when we were exporting from Premiere, all cores eventually ended up clocking down to 1.8 gigahertz. That's an i9 that's getting downclocked significantly. Major throttling happening, but that's not the Mac's fault. It's something to do with the way Premiere utilizes the CPU to encode. This behavior, of course, changed completely when the export format was in H.265. Now, in HEVC, which is surprisingly a more CPU intensive process, the export times are very similar from both the programs, 317 seconds on FCPX and 324 seconds from Premiere Pro for 4K, and for 1080p encodes it was 198 seconds on FCPX and 212 seconds on Premiere Pro. FCPX still comes out far ahead, and it's really cool because that's where you see how Apple's own software leverages the hardware so well. And the best thing is that whatever issue Premiere may have with slow render times can actually be fixed by Adobe. They just have to figure out what's causing it and make sure to mitigate the loads properly so that the CPU is not getting throttled so bad. The other thing that was very interesting is that the new MacBook Pro 16-inch, thanks to its 9th gen processor, supports Intel QuickSync, and then there's also the dedicated T2 chip. Now, QuickSync is Intel's way of essentially speeding up the encoding process for specific formats in specific resolutions. And the T2 chip Apple has programmed to be used essentially to encode and decode video files. So that actually helps speed up the process significantly. So that is also probably why the FCP export times were lower than that of Premiere. But bottom line is that this is still a very, very fast machine. And if you're a photographer, let's talk about photo editing performance. We've covered video, now on to photo. Testing out the MacBook Pro's capabilities as a machine that photographers could rely on, there we go, is actually pretty interesting. So what we did was we loaded a bunch of raw files from a Nikon D850, 45 megapixel raw files. We loaded 500 of them in an Adobe Lightroom catalog and then exported them in batches, a batch of 50, 100, 250 and 500. So that sort of covers the scenario of, let's say, if you're a fashion photographer who's pushing out, just maybe a handful of edits for a client versus, let's say, if you're a wedding photographer who has to export 1,000 images, 2,000, 3,000 images, whatever, right? The number can be as high as possible. But 500 we've realized is sort of the sweet spot, but where the CPU really starts to get taxed. So that's where we chose to cut off. Now, for that, we realized that the MacBook Pro 16-inch, now I'm going to refer to my notes because these are important numbers, to export 50 raw files from their raw format to JPEG in 100% quality, original resolution with color correction and lens profile applied. The MacBook Pro took only 76 seconds. For 100 files, it took 181 seconds. For 250 files, it took 314 seconds. That's about 5 minutes and 14 seconds. And for 500 files, it took only 768 seconds, which is about 12 minutes. What's really fascinating is, now, if you consider the fact, the hardware you have in this machine, the way, how slim it is, how light it is, etc., the only viable competitor is the Dell XPS 15, the 2019 model. That machine comes with an i9 9980H processor. So, it's got a higher clock processor, but we have render times from that machine as well. The XPS 15 does manage to export the 50 and 100 photo batch files much faster at 67 seconds and 124 seconds. But the 250 and 500 image batch test is slower. It's 342 seconds for 250 images and 1186 seconds for 500 images. That's about 30% difference in the time taken to render 500 files. And that's where you realize that the i9 in the Dell XPS 15 is throttling, whereas on the MacBook Pro, it's not. Of course, there are two different chips clocked at slightly different clock speeds, but there's also to do with the thermal design, because we observed that using Intel's Power Gadget, when we did the export, the clock speeds did not drop. They just sort of remain consistent. Your mileage may vary a little bit based on your ambient temperatures. It's winter right now, so it's been pretty cool, 23, 24 degrees ambient temperature. And keeping that in mind, the MacBook Pro Surface does not breach 45 degrees. That's only towards the top. And the CPU temps for Lightroom did not exceed 82 degrees. While exporting from Final Cut Pro X, the CPU temperatures did not exceed 88 degrees. But with Premiere, we did see the CPU hit 98 degrees at some points, which explains why it throttled so much. So that's on the performance. Overall, like, there is zero reason to complain of the MacBook Pro's performance chops. Like, it's got everything covered. There is no way that as a creator, you're going to say that this particular SKU, in fact, is going to be insufficient for you. The only people who may have a problem are VFX artists, for whom 16 GB of DDR4 memory may not be enough and they may want to go for 32. But at the same time, it's not like with only 16 gigs of RAM you cannot work. Everything will still work just fine. So moving on from the performance, let's talk about the display, which is the next big feature of the 16-inch MacBook Pro. As the name suggests, 16 inches, big, right? So the display is bigger, but instead of actually making the whole thing stretch out, what Apple has done is move to a 16:10 aspect ratio. Now, amongst the creative field, you will often notice that if creators are buying monitors, they usually tend to be 16:10, because that little bit of vertical resolution actually does play a big role in allowing us to have more tools visible on the display. So the 16:10 aspect ratio is a beautiful choice. The resolution is just fine. You don't need over the top resolution, but 3072 pixels by 1920 is what this baby rocks. So that's pretty amazing. The color space is sRGB and DCI-P3, and that's amazing, because what that means is you can work in both HDR and non-HDR color spaces. Now, this is a very critical part. Now, pay attention. Peak brightness on the display is north of 450 nits, which means it's definitely got HDR 400 covered. Because it can manage the peak brightness, now let's talk about the color space. Let's say you want to edit, you've shot video in HDR, you've got some HDR10 footage that you want to color grade, etc. in FCP. You can load that footage into FCP. Of course, you've got to create the project with the right color space in mind, but you don't have to alter your entire system's color space to DCI-P3. You can just switch the color space for FCP, and FCP will, whenever FCP is active on the display, you're looking at a DCI-P3 color profile representation, and if you close it, you're seeing sRGB. So if you're going between, let's say, a YouTube tutorial and back into FCP, YouTube and FCP, you're not going to have to switch color profiles every time you switch windows just so you can see things properly. That is a big problem if you're editing on a Windows-based machine and you're working with HDR, because you have to first enable HDR so that Windows operating system can send that HDR10 signal, and then it's just everything turns bad, like everything is washed out. But only HDR content looks good. So with Apple, the way they've designed this is so genius, because you don't have the colors being impacted in other places, especially where they don't need to be. So that's very good. In FCPX, it's a simple toggle, Command U, and then you can switch color spaces from right there. On other editing programs like DaVinci, with Premiere Pro, it could be different. So that's something you'll have to figure out on your own. The other thing about the MacBook Pro's display has been that Apple's always chosen to go with a glossy display, which is still continues to be the case. It would have been nice had they gone with a matte option as well, like they used to many years ago with the 15 and even the 17-inch MacBook Pro. But it's not there. You do get a glossy display, but thankfully the reflections on this thing are very, very well controlled. Of course, you can't be doing color sensitive work while you're out in bright daylight, but given that you can easily work on it in office space, at home, without having to worry about unnecessary reflections. So that's covering the display. Honestly, one of the best displays to edit on. It's been very difficult to go from this back to my Dell U2515 ultra sharp monitor, and that's actually a very high end editing monitor. So there's that. Now let's talk about the keyboard, the trackpad, the touch bar, basically all of the stuff at the bottom of the MacBook Pro. So a lot of people have been complaining over the last few years about the keyboard on the MacBook Pro. The switches that they had used they would break down easily, they did not have enough travel, there was no feedback, they felt spongy, all of that, right? With the MacBook Pro, Apple's sort of changed that completely. They've gone with scissor switches. These are the switches you find on this keyboard, the Magic Keyboard essentially, which comes with the iMac. So the keys are a little more firmer, the feedback is better, and you also get 1 millimeter of travel. Now, if you're a seasoned Apple user, you're like, oh my God, 1 millimeter travel, so cool, oh my God, it's so amazing. No, but like if you're a regular human being, 1 millimeter is not all that much. And honestly, Apple could have done better. But yes, the keys are very stable. What's really cool is that even if you hit the top left edge or whatever corners of the keys, it will still register the keystroke. So it's not just that the center is the only sensitive point. That's one. The second thing is that if you have pudgy fingers like mine, you may end up accidentally hitting other keys. There's not a lot of separation between keys, and they are sort of, the curvature on the keys is so minimal that it's sort of hard to identify it, but it's there. And while this is a personal issue, it may not actually happen with you guys. Getting used to the MacBook Pro keyboard is a little difficult. I have been using an Asus Strix laptop, and that has about 1.8 millimeters of travel, and that keyboard is brilliant to type on. Like my typing speed and accuracy on that is amazing. And after having switched to the MacBook Pro's keyboard, the typing accuracy has definitely gone down. So it takes a little getting used to. The trackpad on the MacBook Pro, oh my God, what do you say about that thing? Like, how do you make something better? I think, personally, if there was something that I would say is the absolute best about MacBook Pros, it's the trackpad. Like, this thing is amazing. I remember there was a time when I had a drawing tablet from Wacom, which was literally this big. Seriously, the active area was just this big. And now I have a trackpad here, which is that good, and it's extremely sensitive. It registers both 1, 2, 3 fingers easily. Gestures work so well, like it makes you think that even the best Windows laptops or the best trackpads are trash. So there's that. Then last but not the least, the touch bar. For some reason, a lot of people have been asking that they wanted the power button and the escape key separated from the touch bar. I understand the logic behind the escape key, because in case your system is frozen and stops responding, getting that escape option to show up on the touch bar may not be possible because the touch bar is contextual. With the physical key, you do have the option of bringing up the force quit menu, and you can get out of the frozen application. But with the power button being separated, well, personally, it didn't really make that big of a difference to me either which way. It's separate, yeah, that's great. So if that's what you wanted, it's here. Whether it's separate or not will actually not play a big role in its functionality, but the fact that the fingerprint sensor is also embedded into the power button is very convenient, honestly, and it works just as fine. The other major upgrade to the MacBook Pro 16-inch is the speakers. Now, this is going to be a fun one. On each side of the keyboard island, you'll find this nice grill which houses 2 speakers and a subwoofer on either side. So that's 4 speakers and 2 subwoofers in total. The sound from this thing is phenomenal. Like, you can watch movies on this and actually feel the sound sort of wrap around you. At home one day, I was watching a movie on this. It was The Matrix, and for a second I was thinking to myself, how did I get my home theater system hooked up to this? And then I realized it wasn't, but the sound was just that good. Not in terms of its loudness, not in terms of, but just the fact that it surrounds you so well. And the really cool thing is that the subwoofers in this do lead to slightly richer bass, but it's not the kind that that's going to make you think, oh my God, where's the bass going to drop? That's not going to happen. The bass is still pretty flat, but it's clear. That's the best part. And there are no vibrations. So when you do listen to bass heavy tracks, Apple's designed this system called force cancellation, where the vibrations generated by one subwoofer are cancelled out by the other, and vice versa. So they sort of keep the Mac stable when there is loud bass heavy music playing. Your hands don't rattle. That's really nice. And honestly, you want to watch a movie with a friend, like you can just watch it on here without having to worry about speakers. MacBooks have usually had good speakers, no doubt, but this is next level good. Like this is really, really good. And it makes you sort of think that maybe I don't need speakers for now. Like if you're especially just casually watching movies or casually listening to music. Not audiophile grade, but still extremely, extremely good. Good luck finding faults with it. The last thing I want to talk about is the battery, because that's another thing that's been upgraded on this machine. The MacBook Pro 16-inch packs a 100 watt-hour battery. Now for those of you who fly often, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, but most airlines will not let you take a battery on board that's bigger than 100 watt-hours in capacity. So this is like the absolute limit. One. The power brick that Apple ships with this is a 97 watt-hour power brick, which is really cool because it's got a Type-C port and supports charging over USB PD. So if you've got a phone that fast charges over USB PD, you can just use that wall brick to charge your phone. Pretty awesome. So it's sort of multifunctional if you need it to be. But the battery life on this thing is shockingly good. Like with the display turned to about 60% brightness, Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth on, I was able to get about 7 hours and 40 minutes of usage out of this, which included a little bit of about 30 minutes of Photoshop use. And of course, like tons and tons of typing. Like this is my daily driver right now. So typing all of my news stories, typing up a review, editing some photos, which is where the 30-minute thing comes in. And, you know, just maybe watching a few YouTube videos with, of course, music also playing in the background. 7 hours, 40 minutes, guys. Like, that's insane. That's insane. That's like MacBook Air level battery life from a machine that's literally one step away from qualifying as a workstation grade machine. If this had a Xeon processor, we would call it a workstation, flat out, no doubt, right? But it's got the most powerful Intel processor, the high-end consumer processor, that is the i9, and it's got a dedicated GPU. It's got a very high resolution display. It's got powerful speakers. It's got a touch bar, which is also draining battery. All of this put together is still allowing you to squeeze 7 hours plus of battery life. That's pretty insane. I mean, what do you say? I mean, I have to say something otherwise, because normally I would be speechless, but this is pretty amazing. This is one of the single biggest reasons why I've had a hard time using any other laptop in the last 2 weeks, because the battery life on this is so good that I can come to work. I know it's charged to 100%, go home at night after 8-9 hours of work and still be able to, you know, do something on this. It's that good. Now let's quickly just sum everything up about the MacBook Pro 16-inch. It's great performance. The throttling problems are actually, I wouldn't call them fixed. I wouldn't say that they're gone, but they're extremely, extremely well controlled. The display is industry leading, top notch. It offers great flexibility for the color spaces you want to work in. The keyboard definitely needs more work, and it requires you getting used to it, even if you're coming from an older Mac. Like, you just need, it's not there yet. The trackpad is brilliant. So, and the 4 Thunderbolt ports offer excellent connectivity. Like, I mean, I know that people complain about the dongle life, but honestly, 4 Thunderbolt ports is insane amounts of speed, and it's insane amount of connectivity. Like at 40 Gbps, that's 4 USB type A ports operating at 3.2 Gen 2 speeds. So you've got really, really fast and extremely expandable ports here as well. So overall, a great machine. And the only problem that you would find with this as a creator is the lack of an SD card slot. And maybe, just maybe, some of you may not think that 4 GB of video RAM or 16 GB of RAM is enough. That's it.